O Lord, my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power throughout the universe displayed. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art! How great thou art! Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art! How great thou art! Who's ever heard of How Great Thou Art before? Oh, good. Someone asked me a while ago, she says, Pastor, why don't you have us sing more of the old hymns? And how I often answer those kinds of things, say, well, thank you for this suggestion. But it was interesting that she would qualify this as an old hymn. And many of you in this room would call that's one of the old standard hymns of the church. And so I started to look at this particular hymn. We've been looking at hymns all month long. We started out with a newer hymn about communion, and then we moved to Wade in the Water, which is a spiritual. And then from there we went to Charles Wesley and listened to a hymn that he composed. And then last week there was a bunch of pieces of music, and now How Great Thou Art, because I don't know how many people tell me that How Great Thou Art is not, if it's not one of their most favorite, it may be the most favorite hymn that they know. And it's sung all over the place. And so I started, well, what's the story behind How Great Thou Art? So we're going to go back to 1885. I have notes today because I am terrible with dates, and it's important about the dates this time. So 1885, and there's a guy named Carl Boberg. Now, Carl is in Sweden, okay? He's not the chef, but he's a Swede over there, and he is a lay pastor in the Swedish Covenant Church. And so he's not, his full-time gig is not being a minister in a church. It's his part-time gig. He's a lay pastor there, and he also has a propensity to write poetry. And so in 1885, he writes this poem called O Stor Gud, which means O Great God. And he writes it in Swedish, and he's inspired by the surroundings that he encounters. He sees God in creation. And so he writes these 9 verses, and one of the things that we heard from his, I think it's his great nephew or something like that, said my uncle was inspired by looking over this bay, Monstoris Bay, and seeing how glassy the sea was, and just seeing how God was at work in there, and that's what inspired him to write these notes, these 9 stanzas of a poem. So he writes the 9 stanzas in 1885. He decides a year later that it would be good that other people would get to see this, so he publishes them in his hometown newspaper. Now, I don't know how many hometown newspapers would publish anybody's poem anymore, but they did back then. So in 1886, a year after he wrote the 9 stanzas, it gets published in his small hometown newspaper. And I'm sure that the people in his hometown went, oh, that's very nice and very good, and then it was kind of forgotten. Now, it's not clear when it starts to morph into something else, but we do know that at some point in time, Carl hears his poem not being read, but being sung. Someone took his poem, his 9 stanzas, and put it to one of the Swedish folk songs. And it was not even clear which one it is. But he goes, oh, wow, there's somebody who's singing my song. So, like any good person, he goes and tries to get it copyrighted, right? Okay, so he goes and tries to get it copyrighted. And eventually he sells the rights to this O Stor Gut to his church. So in 1891, so we started in 1885, right? So 6 years later, he sells a copyright to his church, the Swedish Covenant Church, and that's where O Stor Gut, the beginnings of How Great Thou Art, are placed. When through the woods and forest glades I wander and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees. When I look down from lofty mountain grandeur and hear the brook and feel the gentle breeze, then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. So remember, we put Carl over in Sweden. Now we're going to talk about a missionary. He's from Britain, and he's Methodist, a Methodist missionary. And he is called, appointed, because if he's Methodist, he's told this is where you're going, and he goes to the Ukraine. So he goes to the Ukraine. It's, it's in 1931 that he is going to the Ukraine. Now, I'm not all that familiar with geography, but I'm pretty sure the Ukraine and Poland and Estonia are all over there in the eastern part of Europe. And it's there that Stuart Hine, this English missionary, Methodist, is over here in the Ukraine, and he hears O Stor Gut. He has heard it, though, not in Swedish, but in Russian. Someone has taken O Stor Gut, and they first convert the song from the original Swedish into German. Now, let's just wait for a moment like that for all the good Germans here, like myself. Okay. There's no story behind that part, but I thought so it's German, and then it gets translated into Russian, and that's when this English guy hears this hymn, O Stor Gut. And Stuart Hine is just taken with the song. Now, what he does, it's still, as we understand it, it's still in this, the tune is still this Swedish folk song, and so Stuart starts to go, I think I can do something else with the tune of this song. So he starts messing with the tune of O Stor Gut, and what else he does is he's now translating this song from Russian into English. So we've gone from Swedish to German to Russian, and now we're going into English. Now, he is taken by the Carpathian Mountains, which are in the Ukraine, and he begins to see not only the words that Karl Boberg wrote, but he's also starting to compose some of his own words to this poem, O Stor Gut. And the last 2 verses in particular. So he's taken these pieces and he builds on them. And he starts to change the melody into something that we know today. And when I think that God his Son not sparing sent him to die, I scarce can take it in, that on the cross, my burden gladly bearing, he bled and died to take away my sin. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art. How great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee, how great thou art. How great thou art. So when the war breaks out in 1939, Stuart Hine goes back to England. And it's there that he composes the last two verses of How Great Thou Art. And he does sell the song as well. He gets it copyrighted, and it is now called How Great Thou Art. And it is now the tune that we're familiar with. But Stuart Hine is a Methodist missionary in a small town in England. And although it's published and people have some kind of familiarity with it, it hasn't done really anything in terms of really spurring on people to sing the faith through this particular hymn. It gets printed in a pamphlet. So after the war, I don't know how many pamphlets there are that's running around there, but after the war, there's a missionary who comes over to London. The missionary has anyone heard of Billy Graham before? Some of you, okay, Billy Graham. So we're in the 1950s. We're in 1954, okay? So in 1954, Billy Graham is over here in London, and they're having a revival. They're having a crusade. Now, I want you to remember that in 1954, the name Billy Graham wouldn't have the same kind of name recognition as it would today. He's just getting started. And it's 1955. Did you notice that? How many of you were around in 1955? Some of you were. Okay. So that's when this hymn is going to start to perk up. So when you tell me that you want an old hymn, and then I look at 1955, I don't think any of you around in 1955 are old, okay? This is not one of the old hymns. So there's a couple of singers with the Billy Graham Crusade. One is Cliff Barrow, however you want to say it, and then the other one is George Beverly Shea. And George Beverly Shea sees How Great Thou Art in one of these pamphlets that's floating around, and I don't know where he got it or how it all happened, but I do know that God has his hand kind of working in all this stuff going on. And George Beverly Shea, yeah, this is kind of a neat song here. So he brings it to the team, the crusade team, and the crusade team says, yeah, it does look like it's all right, but not this time. So they wait a year later, and he starts to sing it. George Beverly Shea sings at a crusade in Toronto, Canada. And there, he sings it 45 times for that crusade. And really, it's George Beverly Shea who really brings how great thou art to the place where it is today. Now, granted, all kinds of other artists have sang it after him. My mom is an Elvis fan, so there's one Elvis album that even says, how great thou art. Elvis is singing how great thou art. But it was, when did I say it started? 1885? And here we are in 1955, before it ever starts to really grow. That's 70-some years. When Christ shall come with shouts of acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart? Then I shall bow with humble adoration and there proclaim, my God, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art, how great thou art. I could only do that one service. I remember Sandy Patty singing this song. And for those of you who don't know, Sandy Patty is, she's a Christian artist, and she's a soprano, and she can go like 3 times higher than that. She just blows it out of the water. And I've tried to do that before, and God says, you know, Randy, I want you to remember the story about David. What? David? Yeah. David says, God, I want to build you this great temple. And God says, no. No, that's not your job, David. So he builds the parsonage instead. As I thought, though, about the progression of how this song comes to us and how it comes to be loved, there's 70-some years in the making of how great thou art. And then you take it from 1955 and you bring it to where it is today, and how many people still love it and still call it one of the old hymns. God is at work all the time. And often we don't see it. Often we look at, probably like Carl Boberg when he wrote that O Stor Gut in Swedish in his little town. And it got published in the paper, and a couple of people said, yeah, that's nice. And then they went on with their business. And he really didn't think much more about it. He really would have no idea about how that hymn would impact the lives of millions of people. We don't know how God will impact the lives of millions, or maybe even one other person, with the way that we are called to be in ministry. But that's how God works. Block by block, person by person, event by event, and even the mundane weaved in all of that. Friends, I don't know what's going on in all of your lives. I know some. Most, I don't know anything at all. But I do know that God is working in your life. And although you may wonder about this particular aspect and how it's affecting not only yourself, but other people around you, and how on earth could God really use anything like that in order to draw and to enlarge his kingdom? And if you're asking that question, here's a pretty simple answer. How great thou art. I'm going to invite you to stand and to sing this hymn.